Alright, so we first had the 3900 XT, which was a CPU. Now we've got the 7900 XT, which is a GPU, but there's also the 7900X with no T's, but that's a CPU, and there's also the 7900 XTX, which is a GPU. That's not confusing at all, is it, AMD? Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today is the day we can present our review of the AMD RX 7900 XT and the 7900 XTX. That's right, both of the new RDNA 3 GPUs are in the house. They have been comprehensively benchmarked, and today we're going to tell you exactly how fast these two cards really are. Now, I am going to keep the preamble pretty short, as I know you are going to want to dive straight into the benchmarks, but let's just do a quick spec recap. For starters, we know that these are the world's first chiplet-based gaming GPUs, as they utilise a 5nm GCD or graphics compute die sitting alongside six 6nm MCD or memory cache dies, though it's important to note one of those 6 MCDs is disabled for the 7900 XT. The XTX packs in 96 compute units for 6,144 stream processors, while the XT is cut down to 84 CUs and 5,376 shaders. Both have 192 ROPs, though the XTX is clocked higher at 2,500 MHz boost compared to 2,400 MHz boost for the XT. Now, as for the memory subsystem, the XTX comes with 24GB of GDDR6 memory compared to 20GB for the XT, and both sets of VRAM come clocked at 20GB per second. The XTX does have a wider memory interface though, giving it greater total memory bandwidth of 960GB a second compared to 800GB per second for the XT. And the XT does also feature 16MB less Infinity Cache. Lastly, board power is rated at 355 watts for the XTX, but a late change to the spec sees the XT rated at 315 watts, and that's a 15 watt increase over the originally announced TBP. We do now also have UK pricing that's been confirmed by AMD, though it does also match the announced US dollar pricing. So that means for the 7900 XT, we're looking at £899.99, and for the 7900 XTX, it's £100 more at £999.99. For our testing today then, we are of course using our regular GPU test system for 2022, and this is powered by MSI. Built around Intel's i9-12900K CPU, that is paired with MSI's Meg Z690 Unify motherboard, and we've also got 32GB of Adata XPG Lancer DDR5 memory. We're also using MSI's MPG 321 URQD 4K monitor for all of our testing today, and of course resizable bar is enabled for all supported GPUs. The only other thing to say then just before we do dive into the benchmarks is, in this video I am going to be focusing on the 1440p and 4K data. However, I did test 1080p, so if you want to see those results and every single one of our benchmark charts, you can find that in the written review over on kitguru.net, which will also be linked in the description. With that out of the way though, let's find out exactly how fast these two cards really are. Kicking off then with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Both GPUs do perform well in this title. At 1440p, the 7900 XTX delivers 150 FPS, making it 8% faster than the RTX 4080, and it's actually only 6% slower than the RTX 4090. The RX 7900 XT is good for just over 130 FPS, and that puts it just a few frames behind the 4080, though do remember that this game historically favours AMD hardware. At 4K, the RTX 4090 does pull away, and the 7900 XTX is now 12% slower than Nvidia's flagship, but it's still delivering nearly 100 FPS, while holding a 9% advantage over the 4080. The 7900 XT averages 80 FPS, making it 12% faster than both the RTX 3090 Ti and the RX 6950 XT, while it's 10% slower than the RTX 4080. Cyberpunk 2077 again sees the 7900 XTX outperforming the RTX 4080, this time by 6% at 1440p, though that is in terms of the average frame rates, as Nvidia does have an advantage with the 1% lows. Likewise, the 7900 XT delivers over 100 FPS here, making it 12% faster on average than the 3090 Ti, but with similar 1% low performance. Up at 4K, the 7900 XT can't quite deliver a 60 FPS experience, but it is still doing pretty well, coming in just 6% shy of the RTX 4080, while it's also 36% faster than the last gen 6900 XT. The 7900 XTX is only the second GPU we've tested able to average over 60 FPS here as well, and that makes it 50% faster than the 6950 XT. Days Gone is less favourable to the new RDNA 3 GPUs, though we would expect that from a DX11 Unreal Engine title. At 1440p, the 7900 XTX is slower than the RTX 4080 by 6%, with the XT variant sitting level with the 3090 Ti. At 4K, however, both GPUs do actually fall away somewhat, with the 7900 XTX now just 5% ahead of the 3090 Ti, but 9% slower than the RTX 4080, and we can also see that the 7900 XT comes in 8% slower than the 3090 Ti. As for Dying Light 2 then, it's hard to argue with over 170 FPS on average at 1440p for the 7900 XTX, and that means it sits neck and neck with the RTX 4080, while the 7900 XT is 14% slower than the 4080. At 4K though, the RTX 4080 does drop off a fair bit, and the XTX is able to reach a 10% advantage over its Nvidia rival. Versus the RX 6950 XT, we're looking at a 45% generational uplift for the XTX, whereas the 7900 XT is now 3% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti. Moving on then to Far Cry 6. This game is CPU limited even at 1440p, though Nvidia GPUs did hit a wall before the AMD GPUs in our testing. Still, it's not until we reach 4K resolution that we see meaningful results, with the 7900 XTX offering a tidy 13% performance advantage over the RTX 4080, and that's a 30% boost over the 6950 XT. The 7900 XT also impresses here, offering frame rates that are a match for the more expensive RTX 4080, while it's 13% faster than the 3090 Ti. Nvidia GPUs currently have an issue with the 1% lows in Forza Horizon 5, something we are told that the company is actively investigating, so we would hope for a fix soon. Right now though, AMD GPUs offer a much smoother experience at any resolution, with the 7900 XTX delivering average performance that's only just shy of the RTX 4090 at 1440p, while the 7900 XT is almost matching the RTX 4080. Up at 4K, the XTX holds a tidy 12% lead over the RTX 4080, with the XT model only fractionally behind, though it's actually not a good deal faster than either the 6900 XT or the 6950 XT. AMD GPUs though do have the upper hand again in terms of the 1% lows in God of War, and here the 7900 XTX delivers a 49% boost over its predecessor, the 6950 XT. The 7900 XT also delivers over 150 FPS, and that means it's basically a match for the RTX 4080, but with substantially better 1% lows. The 40 series does pull away at 4K however, and now the 7900 XT is just 4% faster than the 3090 Ti, when it was 12% faster at 1440p, but we can see that the 7900 XTX is still 6% ahead of the RTX 4080. Horizon Zero Dawn is next, and this one is actually a relatively poor performer for the RDNA 3 GPUs, which I have to say is slightly surprising considering how well RDNA 2 scales in this game. At 1440p, the 7900 XTX is just shy of the RTX 4080 in terms of average frame rates, and that is the same up at 4K. It's only 2 to 3% slower admittedly, but Horizon Zero Dawn and Days Gone are the only two games that we tested where the 7900 XTX can't beat the RTX 4080 at 4K. As for Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, at 1440p, the 7900 XT sits right between the 3090 Ti and the 4080, offering 166 FPS on average. It's 42% faster than the 6900 XT, while the 7900 XTX is over 50% ahead of the 6950 XT, while it's also 8% faster than the RTX 4080. Up at 4K, the AMD GPUs again do fall off slightly, as the XTX is now just 4% faster than the 4080, so performance is basically the same. That's also the case between the 7900 XT and the RTX 3090 Ti, with both GPUs hovering around the 95 FPS mark. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another decent showing for RDNA 3 though, with the RX 7900 XTX averaging over 160 FPS at 1440p, where it's 8% faster than the RTX 4080. As for the 7900 XT, this card is also only 5% slower than the 4080, while it's impressively 17% faster than the 3090 Ti. As for 4K performance, the 7900 XT is now a match for the RTX 4080, with both cards averaging just over 90 FPS, and that really is a great result for the AMD GPU considering its price point. Moving on to Resident Evil Village, here the 7900 XTX delivers over 300 FPS at max settings at 1440p, which is a bit ridiculous, and it's actually only just shy of the RTX 4090, though that GPU is definitely being bottlenecked by the CPU. At 4K though, we still get 180 FPS on average with the XTX, and it's again 14% ahead of the RTX 4080, while the XT isn't far behind either, with just a 6% difference between those two GPUs. Last of all, we come to Total War Warhammer 3. The 7900 XTX is slightly faster than the RTX 4080 on average at 1440p, though its 1% lows aren't quite as smooth. The 7900 XT also delivers a solid 37% uplift compared to the 6900 XT, though again the 1% lows do lag behind the likes of the RTX 3090 Ti. It's the same story at 4K as well, with less than 5% between the XTX and the RTX 4080, though again the 1% lows do lag behind. Versus the 6950 XT, however, we see a massive 57% uplift for the RDNA 3 GPU, the biggest generational improvement from the 12 games we've tested. So there we have it, 12 games have been benchmarked, but let's see how things stack up with the big picture overview. Starting with the RX 7900 XTX, AMD's flagship averages just under 181 FPS at 1440p. That makes it 5% faster than the RTX 4080, 11% slower than the RTX 4090, while it's a 32% improvement over the RX 6950 XT. The RX 7900 XT, meanwhile, delivers exactly 160 FPS on average, and that makes it 11% slower than its XTX sibling. It's also 7% slower than the RTX 4080, 12% faster than Nvidia's previous generation flagship, the RTX 3090 Ti, while it also comes in 26% faster than the RX 6900 XT. Up at 4K resolution, the 7900 XTX does actually look a bit better versus the RTX 4080, as it's now 7% faster on average, though it is also still 19% slower than the RTX 4090. Compared to the previous generation AMD flagship, the 7900 XTX is 39% faster than the 6950 XT. Meanwhile, the 7900 XT does fall further behind the XTX at 4K, as the XT proves to be 15% slower on average. It's also now 9% behind the RTX 4080, while proving 7% faster than the 3090 Ti and 28% faster than its predecessor, the RX 6900 XT. As always, it is worth saying that this data does very much depend on the sample of games tested. I always do my best to incorporate a wide range of results, and we have benchmarked 12 different games, but my recommendation to you guys is to check out a bunch of other reviews, as depending on the games benchmarked, you may well see different margins between the GPUs on test. So as always, go ahead and check out some other reviews to get a better idea of the exact spread of performance. For now though, I am going to go ahead and use my average performance data so we can take a look at the cost per frame, starting with the MSRP data before we move on to current retail pricing. Starting at 1440p then, using the MSRP data, here the RX 7900 XTX comes in at £5.54 per frame, and that is actually slightly better value than the RX 7900 XT. That's not something we typically see, and it's certainly not what you want to see from a cheaper component. Both of those RDNA 3 GPUs are overall very similar to previous generation cards like the RTX 3080 10GB and the RX 6800 XT, though the 7900 XTX is 26% cheaper per frame than the 6900 XT. As for the 4K data, here the gap between the XT and the XTX actually widens, and not in the way you'd want. The XT actually comes in 6% more expensive per frame. Now, it is still 22% better value than the 6900 XT using MSRP pricing, while the XTX marks a hefty 35% reduction to cost per frame when compared to the 6950 XT. Based on current pricing, however, things don't look as attractive for both of these RDNA 3 GPUs. At 1440p, for instance, overall value is basically a match for both the 6900 XT and 6950 XT, which can now be found well below MSRP. At 4K, the XTX is still offering the best value of the two, and generally it is pretty good overall, though we have to say it's not really much of an improvement gen on gen. Here we're looking at just a 4% improvement versus the 6950 XT using current retail prices, and the same also goes for the 7900 XT. We can't go any further in this review though without talking about ray tracing. Always a contentious topic. A lot has actually been made of the AMD first-party benchmarks that they released during the launch announcement for these two GPUs. So let's go ahead and put these cards to the test and find out exactly how well RDNA 3 deals with ray tracing enabled. Kicking off then with Cyberpunk 2077, this game is a tough test for any DXR enabled GPU, though I can't say I was surprised to see the RDNA 3 cards lagging behind the RTX 40 series. At 1440p, the 7900 XTX can barely hold above 30 FPS for its 1% lows, and the XT actually falls below that to 26 FPS, so both GPUs are sitting either side of the RTX 3080. That also means that the 7900 XTX is 33% slower than the RTX 4080. Stepping up to 4K really is too much for all GPUs apart from the RTX 4090, and we can see the performance of the 7900 XTX is roughly on par with the 3080 Ti. Moving on though, Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered is a better showing for the RDNA 3 cards, however, perhaps as a result of this game's RDNA 2 console roots. With ray tracing enabled, the 7900 XTX still delivers well over 120 FPS, with the XT coming in at 114 FPS, so both are actually only slightly behind the RTX 4080, though the 40 series GPUs are actually CPU limited here. Even at 4K though, the 7900 XTX is able to effectively match the RTX 4080, which I certainly wasn't expecting. Gen on gen, it's a 55% uplift versus the 6950 XT, while the 7900 XT averages 65 FPS, and that makes it 42% faster than the 6900 XT. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition is another tough showing for the RX 7900 XT. Performance is reasonable enough at 1440p, coming in just ahead of the RTX 3090. It does fall off at 4K though, where it is now 29% slower than the RTX 4080, and it's just about matching the 3080 Ti. The 7900 XT also drops below the RTX 3080, coming in 7% slower on average. Lastly, we finish up with a look at Resident Evil Village. Here, the 7900 XT breezes through the game's relatively light RTFX, and it's a rough match for the RTX 3090 even at 4K, averaging 107 FPS. Meanwhile, the XTX offers 127 FPS on average, and that makes it 8% slower than the RTX 4080. That is more or less it then for the gaming performance side of things, but we're going to shake things up a bit, take a look at the reference designs before seeing how they perform with things like thermals and acoustics. At first glance then, taking a look at these two reference designs, you would be forgiven for thinking that they are identical. The XTX is actually slightly larger though, being both taller and longer, and it actually has larger fans too, coming in at 85mm across compared to 80mm for the 7900 XT. Both are made from the same aluminium alloy, however, and they really do feel very solid in the hand. I have to say, I also much prefer this kind of all-black aesthetic compared to the silver elements that were on the RX 6000 series, so in my view, it really is a very premium design from AMD. Much has been made of the size of these cards as well. They're both 2.5 slot designs, with the XTX measuring in at 287mm long compared to 276mm for the XT. This means that both cards are smaller than the RTX 4080 Founders Edition in every dimension, and they're also lighter. The XT weighs in at 1.51 kilos, with the XTX at 1.8 kilos, while the Founders Edition 4080 tips the scales at 2.14 kilos. We can also see that AMD has indeed decided to stick with the two PCIe 8-pin power connectors, and that really is no problem at all in my book. I would say that it's really not like AMD saw the controversy around the 12-volt high power connector and decided to ditch it last minute. These things are decided well in advance, but at the very least it means you don't need a new cable or adapter, so yep, it gets the job done. On the I/O as well, we can also see two full-size DisplayPort 2.1 connectors, while the USB-C does also offer DisplayPort 2.1 functionality. However, it is worth noting that these are limited to 54 gigabits per second rather than the full 80 gigabits per second as outlined by the DisplayPort spec. However, this is still a big increase in bandwidth compared to DisplayPort 1.4, so you definitely would rather have it than not. Checking out performance of the reference designs now then, I'm going to start off with a look at operating clock speed. We put both of these cards through a 30-minute stress test, with the 7900 XT averaging 2578 MHz compared to 2581 MHz for the XT. Interestingly though, we can actually see that the clocks bounced around a lot more for the XT card versus the XTX, with the XTX looking a lot more stable in terms of its frequency dispersion over the 30-minute stress test. It's possible that the XT was hitting its power limit more frequently than the XTX, though right now that is just an educated guess. Moving on to thermals though, the reference design for both models is perfectly fine for dealing with the heat output. In both cases actually, the GPU peaked at 63 degrees, with the hotspot coming in at 77 degrees for the XT, while it was just a touch warmer for the XTX. Noise levels are also fine. Neither card is the quietest out there, but they're not obnoxiously loud either. In both cases actually we saw the fans ramp up to 64% or around 1700 RPM under prolonged load, with the difference in noise coming down to the size difference of the fans. Unfortunately, both of my samples did exhibit a bit of coil whine. It wasn't awful, but it was noticeable, and here's a quick sound test. Moving on now to power draw. This is always a key focus as part of my reviews, and as a reminder, for this we use Nvidia's PCAP tool, which measures power draw through a PCIe riser, so you get power draw readings from the PCIe slot, as well as the 8-pin power connectors themselves. We also use this on a per game basis, so we have power draw figures for every single game we tested at 3 different resolutions. That is, of course, far too much data to go over in this video, so we're only going to focus on the average figures here, but if you do want to see all of that data in absolute fine detail, head over to the written review on kitguru.net. Starting at 1440p then, we can see that both cards do indeed draw similar power to the rated TBPs. The RX 7900 XTX drew 354.5 watts on average, compared to 306.7 watts for the XT. Interestingly though, and this is I think a pretty important point, it does look like Nvidia GPUs actually have a clear advantage in terms of power draw, as they draw significantly less power when they're not fully utilized, whereas RDNA 3 GPUs still draw similar amounts of power even when not fully loaded. Far Cry 6 at 1440p is a really good example of this. There is a clear CPU limit at this resolution, but both the XT and XTX are drawing over 300 watts with power draw figures pretty similar to the rated TBP. The RTX 4080 meanwhile is barely drawing over 200 watts, and that's well below the rated TGP for that card, massively improving overall efficiency. Moving on to 4K power draw though, here this is again in line with the 355 watt TBP for the 7900 XTX, as it averaged 355.7 watts across the 12 games we tested. Now this is actually 75 watts more power than the RTX 4080, and that's a 26% difference, despite only a 7% delta in gaming performance. Something which has clear implications for efficiency, as we are about to see. The 7900 XT, meanwhile, averaged 310.2 watts, and again, that's still 30 watts more power than the RTX 4080, despite being the slower GPU. For those interested as well, we will also take a quick look at how the power draw is spread across the PCIe slot and the 2 power connectors. Starting with the 7900 XT, we're looking at around 35 to 40 watts coming through the PCIe slot, with the rest coming through the 2 8-pin cables. More power does appear to be coming through the right-hand power cable than the one on the left though these do rapidly change and fluctuate. As for the 7900 XTX, we're now looking at between 45 to 50 watts through the PCIe slot, and once more the right-hand 8-pin connector is drawing more power. Again, it does still vary very rapidly, but we did actually see up to a 30 watt delta in certain situations. As for what those overall power figures mean for efficiency, I think the data is pretty clear. RDNA 3 is definitely a step forward compared to RDNA 2, but it just can't match the overall efficiency of Ada Lovelace. At 1440p, for instance, the 7900 XT only offers an 11% improvement in performance per watt versus the RX 6800, though relative to the 6950 XT, which is RDNA 2's least efficient GPU, we're now looking at a 31% improvement. However, it is still 24% less efficient than the RTX 4080. Lastly, at 4K, the 7900 XT is actually a touch less efficient than the XTX. Again, not something at all that we would usually see, as typically the lower power SKUs are more efficient. Admittedly, there's only 3% in it, but it was repeatable over the 12 games we tested. It's also interesting to see that the 7900 XTX still lags behind the RTX 40 series, delivering 11 and 14% worse efficiency than the RTX 4090 and 4080 respectively. The final area I want to check out then is going to be manual overclocking, though I guess spoiler alert, the results are fairly unimpressive. Starting with the 7900 XTX, here we set the minimum GPU frequency to 2500 MHz and 2900 MHz for the maximum GPU frequency, with the VRAM slider up to 2730 MHz. For the 7900 XT, we set the minimum frequency to 2400 MHz, the maximum up to 2900 MHz, and the memory slider up to 2700 MHz. As a result of these overclocks then, the 7900 XT did gain the most performance, between 6 to 7% in the titles we retested, which is fine, though actually the XTX barely improved at all, with just 3 to 4% gains in the titles we retested. That was actually despite a huge increase to power draw, up to over 415 watts for the XTX, while the XT was also drawing over 360 watts. Interestingly though, when reviewing the data logs for the 7900 XTX overclock, I actually noticed that the GPU hotspot temperature had ramped all the way up to 100 degrees, peaking at 102 Celsius, even with the fan speed at 100%. As this is the only 7900 XTX card that I've been able to test, we obviously can't say if this will apply to all XTX models, though if I had to guess, it's possible that the 415 watt power draw is just too much for the reference design to handle, so we could be seeing the clock speed being thermally limited, which again could well explain why our overclocking results were pretty disappointing. Well then, it has been some time coming, and there has definitely been a lot of hype around the RDNA 3 GPUs, but today, at long last, we have been able to present our findings. In my view, these cards are good, but they haven't blown me away, and they certainly haven't struck a decisive blow to Nvidia. Starting with rasterization performance then, this is the strongest area for RDNA 3, as the RX 7900 XTX is faster than the RTX 4080. Not always by much, but it is 7% faster on average at 4K. Obviously, considering the price point, if rasterization performance is your main priority, ignoring things like ray tracing and DLSS, then that does mean the 7900 XTX is better value, as it's also £200 cheaper, but is the slightly faster card. The generational gains though is a different story. For instance, we saw the 7900 XTX coming in 39% faster on average than the 6950 XT, with the 7900 XT coming in 28% faster than the 6900 XT. Of course, these are clear improvements, but I would say AMD is guilty of overselling these GPUs somewhat. Certain games like Spider-Man Remastered did show performance increases between the 50 and 70% margin that AMD themselves showed off, but there were also other titles like Horizon Zero Dawn where the generational improvements were much, much smaller. Ray tracing, however, continues to be an area of weakness for AMD, and they do remain significantly behind Nvidia in this regard. I do think it's important to stress that ray tracing performance has still improved, and you will get a much more playable experience with RDNA 3 versus RDNA 2. That being said though, there's still certain games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition where these RDNA 3 GPUs were basically on par with the likes of the RTX 3080 and the 3080 Ti, so there's very much still a generational gap between Team Green and Team Red when it comes to ray tracing. I also have to admit that I was hoping for more in terms of the overall power efficiency of these GPUs. It seemed to me that AMD was really focusing on this area in the run-up to the launch of these two cards, and they even themselves said there was a 54% improvement in performance per watt versus RDNA 2. At best, I found the 7900 XTX was able to deliver a 35% efficiency improvement versus the 6950 XT at 4K, though it was even less than that compared to the RX 6800. The RTX 4080 though actually offers 16% better performance per watt at 4K, and even the RTX 4090 doesn't draw that much more power than the 7900 XTX, being about 30 watts or so, despite the 4090 being 23% faster on average. Speaking specifically to the 7900 XT for a moment, I have to say that this has been a bit of a weird card to assess. For starters, right now it doesn't actually have a direct competitor. Of course, we are expecting it to go head to head with the rumoured 4070 Ti, but right now that is exactly that, a rumour. Even compared to the 7900 XTX though, the XT model looks pretty confused, I have to say. It actually offers worse value at 1440p and 4K, and it's also less efficient at 4K than the XTX model. And usually we'd expect the cheaper card to be better value, and we'd expect the lower power card to be more efficient, but that is not the case for the XT. I have to say it is definitely the weakest of these two GPUs I have looked at today, and to me it really does look like the classic upsell option to get you spending that extra £100 for the 7900 XTX. Whether or not you should actually pay £1,000 for the 7900 XTX though is another matter entirely. We've already said that it is good value if rasterization performance is your top priority. However, I personally think that ray tracing performance is getting more and more important, and it can't be ignored. Added to that, I also think it's fair to say that Nvidia does have a feature advantage, particularly when looking at DLSS, which is supported in more games than FSR and is generally of a slightly higher image quality. Let's also not forget that AMD currently has no answer to DLSS 3 frame generation. I also think it's important to remember that here we are comparing the 7900 XTX to the RTX 4080, which itself we have already said is relatively poor value, but even then I don't think the 7900 XTX is blowing it away. Or to put it another way, I don't think it would take much more of a price cut to the 4080 to really make life difficult for the XTX, as we've already seen the 4080 drop down to £1,099 here in the UK. To be clear then, AMD has definitely made big strides with RDNA 3, and I do think the 7900 XTX is worth buying depending on your priorities. I just don't think that this is a conclusive victory for Team Red. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, I want to hear from you guys. Let me know your thoughts on the whole GPU landscape, how RDNA 3 stacks up to the 40 series, down in the comments below. Please do also subscribe and ring that notification bell if you haven't already, and why not come carry on the conversation in our Discord server, which is linked in the description. While you're there, you can also find a link to our brand new merch store, rocking some snazzy designs like these ones that you can see on screen right now. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you could even consider backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys, hope you liked the review, and I'll see you in the next video.